Hello and welcome to Meet the Leader. I am your host, Gwamaka Kifukwe. On tonight's program, we'll be discussing the challenges of transition and change, and particularly crisis, from one of Africa's presidents who handled this more times than most. We'll be hearing from His Excellency Joaquim Chissano, former president of Mozambique. President Chissano, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
I'd like to start with a very broad question. Can you please describe to us how you got involved in the independence movement of Mozambique?
It's a question which deserves a very long answer. But to be short, I would say that Mozambique was colonized by a dictatorial regime of Portugal. And so from that point, there were no liberties in Portugal itself, and less in the colonies. So you can see that there were many problems involved which raised a state of mind which could see that something had to change. First was to try to get education which was denied to, or an adequate education was denied to the indigenous people. And in this process there were many exchange of views among the youth and so on in different parts of Mozambique. But it was really in the 40s that these nationalist feelings started to grow, and President Eduardo Mondlane went to study in South Africa, and he was expelled from one of the universities, from the university where he was, because he was black. And he came back and he inspired a youth which was already organized somehow in Mozambique, in what was called the Lourenço Marques, which today is Maputo, and inspired them to get more organized, to study and to conquer this tool of knowledge, which would then work for their freedom and equality. But there was a little of this sentiment everywhere. But I'm taking this example because then I will come in there. Will not talk about all my childhood, what I saw as the suffering of the people, the suffering of my suffering also. Maybe my suffering was not that much compared to other people, but I could see this, to live these realities. And so this construed my mind of nationalism without me knowing that that was what's happening. Mm-hmm. Well, now this group of youth, which was inspired by President Mondlane, constituted finally and what they called the nucleus of the African secondary school students. Mm-hmm. Because nucleus, because it was composed of very few blacks who had succeeded to go into the secondary school, and a good number of them were studying during the night because they were adults who were making their own efforts and to study. And that's Then after that I came to the secondary school. I came to the secondary school in 1951, and soon 1952 or 53, between 52 and 53, I joined this nucleus of students. And I stayed on, and by 1957, I became a leader of that movement, that nucleus. When I finished the secondary school, I went to Portugal in 1960. Arrived on the 8th November. That time in Portugal, also the politics were hot.
In Portugal?
In Portugal itself. At the same time, in Guinea-Bissau, there was already a fight for independence. In Angola, they were also agitating a lot, which culminated with the beginning of the armed struggle on the 4th of February 1961. Therefore, this found me in Portugal. And so the contacts with the other students of these colonies, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, Angola, São Tomé and Príncipe, and Mozambique, all the 5 colonies of Portugal in Africa had some students there. The small number was those from Mozambique. So because of all this tension which was there in Portugal, and the reaction of the dictatorship to what was happening in Angola, and they started persecuting students. And as we had started also getting involved, actually in the case of the Mozambicans, it was in pursuance of what we had started discussing when we were in secondary school, maybe from 1958, 59, we were already discussing not exactly about how to liberate the country, but about how to fight against all this discrimination, all these policies and whatnot. But when we were in Portugal, we were really sure that now we should embark on a fight for independence. I must also give you another reference point that in 1957 there was the independence of Ghana. That's why we discuss these problems now since
something was possible.
57, and then in 1960 was the independence of Congo. So it coincided with the time we left to Portugal. But because of this persecution of students, the students organized themselves with the support of some Mozambicans outside Portugal, namely President Eduardo Mondlane was in the United States of America. He was working at the United Nations, and he was linked with some church organizations who were working in Angola and in Mozambique, some based in Switzerland, some in America. So he had these contacts, but also the leftist movements, including the Communist Party of Portugal, have contacts with some students. It culminated in the organization of withdrawal of all students, or the most part of the students from the colonies, from Portugal to France as a first step. Some went to Germany. And it was we left Portugal in an underground movement. It was, we left secretly, crossing the borders, not from the border posts, but we had to before we got arrested, we should go out. And some knew that there were liberation movements, like those from Angola and from Guinea-Bissau, and some they knew that they were going to join their liberation movements. And we, the Mozambicans, learned also that there were liberation movements, but we did not know exactly how to contact them. And so we could contact them when we reached Paris. And so we started contacting our own liberation movements. I stayed in France for 2 years, but soon after our arrival, Dr. Eduardo Mondlane came to see us in Paris. And that's, I can say that now my joining the liberation struggle openly starts there. Sure. This contact, and the contact with the General Secretary of what was called the Conference of the nationalist movements of the Portuguese colonies. We contacted him. He is a Mozambican, and he was based in Rabat. And we had a contact with him. Actually, we had a chat with him, and he was a member of one of the liberation movements which were created. And those liberation movements were created in 1960. One was created here in Dar es Salaam. It was Manu, and the other one was created in Rhodesia. It was Udenamo. The Manu, it was a Mozambique African Union, which was inspired by TANU, yes. Tanganyika African National Union. We knew of the existence of these movements. When we met with the President Mondlane on 2 occasions, we decided, he and us, decided not to join directly these movements, but instead work for the unity of these movements. Okay. At that time we knew about 2, but later on we came to know about the 3rd one, which was created in Malawi. Okay. So we started working for the unity of these movements to create a front. Yeah. We did not believe in the success of the struggle against colonialism with the divided movements. We had already the example of what was happening in Angola, yeah, where you had the MPLA and UPA. There were 2 movements. And so the coordination of the struggle was very difficult. And that's how I was chosen to come to Dar es Salaam and talk with the 2 movements towards their unification. I was representing the National Union of the Mozambican Students, which we had created when we arrived in Paris, National Union of the Mozambican Students. We were not many, but we were very much vocal. And so we gave the impression that we're a bigger movement. Yes. And so we use this to challenge this movement. We say the students will not support your movement if you don't unite. And so they were thinking about a big organization. So it was a big pressure which we were put to this two movements. But at the same time, President Nyerere and President Nkrumah were working towards the same, coordinated with President Dr. Mondlane, who met them at the United Nations in several occasions. Yeah. So that's the first time I came to Dar es Salaam for this purpose. Sure. And we succeeded in general. And in 1962, the front was formally created on 25th of June. And then there was a Congress in September, which was called the Constitutive Congress. I received my membership card of the front, which I had helped to create. So that's how I joined Frelimo. I created and joined Frelimo, and I received the first cards, which were distributed with the date of 25th of June of 1962.
But I want to fast forward a few years. You still have the Frelimo as a movement that is struggling for independence. And then in 1969, you have the assassination of Eduardo Mondlane, who you've mentioned several times. How did the leadership of the movement handle that crisis? How were you able to overcome that and sustain the momentum, as it were?
Yeah. Well, President Eduardo Mondlane was killed by a bomb concealed in a book. And this is following a period of turmoil inside Frelimo, caused by people who they were taken by the manipulations of the Portuguese colonialism, because the Portuguese had their own underground activities, even here in Tanzania. They were working here and also in the fighting areas, in the liberated zones, and so on. And so they created some divisionism. They provoked a desire for power, ambition for power, in the minds of some of the leaders of the movement, both at the provincial level and the central level. That led us to organize a Congress, the second Congress, which we had wanted to avoid to have a Congress during the war. But we said no, there's no other alternative but to have that Congress. And so we had the second Congress, and the organization of this Congress was very much controversial. After the Congress, there were some assassinations. Before the Congress, there was assassinations, because there were those who didn't want the Congress to take place in the liberated areas in Mozambique. They wanted the Congress here in Dar es Salaam, and those who wanted it there. So when Edward Mondlane was assassinated, there was a problem of who would succeed him. At that time, we had a president who was Edward Mondlane and a deputy president who was Uriah Simango. Uriah Simango thought that he should be the successor of Edward Mondlane because he was deputy president. But Uriah Simango was the one involved in this factionalism. So first, because of that, it could not be obvious that he would succeed Mondlane. Secondly, we thought that he was elected as vice president. So we agreed that he should assume ad interim the role of the president of Relimo until the time when we were going to decide who should replace him. Now, there is a question whether we call for a Congress, but this time it was clear that to call for a Congress it would be to waste time in favor of the enemy because there was a strong pressure from the Portuguese army. And actually we believe that the killing of Mondlane was to create a weakness in our side. Fortunately, we were encouraged by President Nyerere to proceed the armed struggle with the strong support of Tanzania in what concerns the logistics. We tried to keep the unity. And so Samora Machel was the leader of the main front of the struggle, the main direction of the struggle, which was the armed struggle. Yeah. So he and the other leaders, and I also was already a leader, was a member of the Politburo. We decided that we would call for an enlarged meeting of the Central Committee for the Tanzanians not to make a mistake. For us, the Central Committee is it's the Executive Committee. It was in the Tano. So for us, it was the reverse. But I was a member of both the Executive Committee, Politburo, or Political Committee, and the Central Committee. And so was Samora Machel and many others. So Marcelino dos Santos and the others. So we decided that we should have this enlarged meeting, chaired by the vice president, but it should be enlarged to analyze the situation, all the conflict which preceded the death of Mondlane, to see how far this conflict could have contributed to open the space in our ranks to enable the enemy to hand over a bomb in the hands of President Mondlane himself. And well, it became after the investigations which were made by the Tanzanian police, Interpol, and our judgment or this analysis, it became clear that yes, there were some complicities inside the movement itself. For someone would have received this bomb, this book, without knowing probably the book, it might have come from Mozambique and through Tumbeya, and one of our members, who was a member also of Central Committee, would have carried the book to Dar es Salaam. And in Dar es Salaam, the book was handed over together with the other courier to one of the leaders who was working at headquarters. And that is the one who handed over the book to President Mondlane. Now, there were interrogation marks. Who knew that that was a book with a bomb? And the way the book was handed over raised a lot of questions, because the book was handed over to President Mondlane only when he was already in his car, ready to move, while the other courier was handed over to him while he was inside the office.
So some discrepancies in that. So
he left the office to the car, and only later someone was told to run with this book to give him. So we speculated that, well, maybe it was intended to give the book that way so that he doesn't open the book in the office. Otherwise, even the one who was handing would be killed, and other people, because the bomb was very powerful. Yeah. So the Central Committee enlarged to other cadres who had come from the interior of the country, and it took many days. I don't remember how many. It was close to 20 days maybe. Okay. We discussed about everything, and so finally we decided we were not going to call for a Congress to elect the new president, but that the front would be led by a triumvirate. So chaired by the vice president, who then would cease to be called the vice president, but would be the chairman of the triumvirate, and comprising the leader who led the main front, which is the armed struggle with Samora Machel, and the man who led the other important front, which was the diplomatic struggle. It was Marcelino dos Santos. So the three of them were members of the triumvirate. That's how we solved. But the vice president, being one of the ambitious people, well, not one, the ambitious people who wanted to be president, he did not agree with this. Well, he agreed there, yeah, but later on he did not agree, and so he started writing against his own movement, his own front, and published a document here in Dar es Salaam. This is a document which angered the authorities here, including President Nyerere, because he didn't understand why amidst a struggle one would dare to try to destroy the movement and the efforts which were being made for the liberation. So that culminated in the withdrawal of Simango, the vice president, who didn't want to come to the subsequent meetings which were scheduled to take place in Dar es Salaam. The ambition was such that he started getting afraid. He thought that, well, we were trying to arrest him, go and kill him or so. So he finally escaped from Tanzania, went to Nairobi, that because there was no the vice president was no longer there, the triumvirate was no longer a triumvirate, we decided, no, let us, that element which we wanted to avoid of separatism was no longer there. We decided then to elect among us through the Central Committee, again in a very much enlarged Central Committee. President Samora was the one who was chosen. Mm. But because we are speaking about the leadership here, I would like to inform you that the choice there was not easy. Mm. But it was not easy not because of what happens very often, that everybody wants to be a president. Mm-hmm. Here it was difficult because no one wanted to be president. No one wanted.
So how did you manage to convince one or the other to take the position?
I was contacted, it was one of those contacted that, well, I could be, actually contacted by Samora Machel. Mm-hmm. Says, you should take this. I said no. And
but why? Why was no one keen on that position?
We were not interested in posts. We were interested in the struggle, in the success of the struggle. Mm-hmm. And we could see who had the merit. And we, many of us were unanimous in saying that it would be Samora because he was leading the main front of the struggle, which was armed.
Very powerful kind of symbol.
Yeah. But he had a different view, was that in order to concentrate on the armed struggle, he should not be the president, because the president had to deal with the diplomatic area, the educational area, the cultural area, and so on and so on. Mm-hmm. But we had to convince him to accept. Yeah. I must tell you one point which I should not forget. Mm-hmm. He cried when we were forcing him to accept, and he cried because and when he finally accepted, he cried because he thought it was a very heavy task. Yeah. So to show the responsibility of each one of us there, do not to take things very lightly. You see, you had this Simangu who did not measure the importance of this post he wanted to be president. All others thought that it was something of big responsibility. Yeah. And there should be unanimity on who is chosen and so on. Yeah. So we succeed to have that unanimity to say that Samora Machel is the president, and we appointed Marcelino dos Santos as the vice president again, through the same logic that the second front of activity was the diplomatic area. Mm-hmm. And from there on, the struggle went fast.
Yeah. But and now, I mean, you succeeded eventually in liberating Mozambique. But not very long after, you then come to another crisis, and this is now the death of Samora Machel. And at this point, you now emerged. But how did you handle that crisis? Because this was now after independence. It's a different kind of crisis. Yeah. So how did the leadership overcome this second death within its leadership? And what were the mechanisms? What took place that you then emerged as then the interim and then finally as the president?
I should say, rather than when we were winning the war in 1974, the Portuguese came to negotiate with us after the changes which occurred in Portugal also. Yep. So there was a new Portuguese government, and they came to discuss, to negotiate with us. And in on the 7th of September, then we have signed the ceasefire and the end of the hostilities in the war. They had accepted the principle of independence, unconditional, and they had accepted that Frelimo was the legitimate representative of the people. Therefore, the transfer of power from the colonialism should go to Frelimo. Therefore, it was necessary to appoint someone who to lead a transitional government, which comprised 2/3 of the ministers or members of the government appointed by Frelimo, and 1/3 appointed by the Portuguese. The Politburo, as we call it now, political committee, elected me to be that leader of the transition government. I worked for 9 months, and which led us to the date of the proclamation of independence. After that, a few days after the proclamation of the independence, I was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs. When the plane of President Samora Machel crashed, I was in the air, coming from New York, where I had gone for the General Assembly of the United Nations. I did not know what was happening. Only when we arrived in Beira, it was announced that the plane could not land in Maputo, and we had to land in Beira. Only after landing it, that we were told that the airport was closed because the plane of President Machel had not turned up in Maputo. So they were still looking for whereabouts of the plane. And only when I arrived in Maputo, I was informed that the plane had crashed. To cut story short, before the funeral, the country, was led by the vice president of Frelimo, who was then the speaker of parliament. And because in this capacity as Speaker of Parliament, he took the chair of the head of state. I must say that he never went to the office of the head of state. But from the party he led, because what they had decided to do was to try and consult each other. Interestingly enough is that I was not consulted. So the consultations went around me and without me knowing what was happening actually. And they came to a consensus that they should ask me to be the president of Frelimo and the president of the country, of the republic. So they sent one comrade to come and have the feeling of how I felt about this. And so he came and he said, well, I came here to tell you that you should not refuse. Without telling me what. Refuse what? I said, no, because normally you refuse. So what normally? No, so he was recalling that when Monjan died and there was the same consultation, yes, and I said no. And so he said, no, this time you should not refuse. But I did not know what, but I guessed. But he went to report, he said, Chissano is the same. He may say no. So they sent me a second delegation, now comprised of two, not one comrade. And they said, no, we all want you to be the president. So I said, well, we shall see. Let me think. I didn't feel comforted. I was feeling an uneasiness on how to respond. But I made a thorough analysis, and I came to the conclusion that I had been chosen as a prime minister before because of a certain number of considerations which President Samora Machel has made. Which I came to know later, that it's because I was considered as a cool man. I had a temperament which would enable me to sustain some agitated circumstances. And also taking into consideration some psychological problems in our society. You know, Marcelino dos Santos is a colored. And in those days, because of what was happening, the division, racial division which exists in the colonial days, because we also had some sort of apartheid in Mozambique, which was not dividing only between white and black, but also coloreds and black, and coloreds and whites, and Indians and whatnot. This is one of the considerations that President Samora Machel might have taken when he appointed me as Prime Minister, is that Marcelino dos Santos was number two, would not give this image of a change in Mozambique if he went there at that time. We had no problem in the movement, but the broad masses were not educated to take this new reality of non-racialism, non-tribalism, regionalism. So we had to give time for that education. So I found that, well, maybe when they chose me, they had come through the same considerations. That not to take Marcelino dos Santos immediately to succeed Samora Machel. They might have been careful. So I went to the to the Politburo meeting with a conditionality for me to accept. And the conditionality was that each one of the members should pledge to give me the contribution, a support, not only a support by word, but during my work to appoint what the solutions of problems could be, to correct me if I commit some mistake without letting me commit mistakes to blame me later on, and so on. So I wanted to have a unanimity, not a consensus, but unanimity on these questions. Yeah. That, in other words, I'm taking the presidency, but it should be regarded as a collective presidency, because I would be open to each one of them, but I would also do the maximum to consult
to stay open to them.
Each one of them. So I was telling them, by other words, that I was not feeling competent to take the steps of Samora Machel and Eduardo Mondlane and go in front. So they all pledged to support me. And so that's how we went to the Central Committee, and the same exercise was made. Of course, in the Central Committee, I didn't demand much because the Central Committee was 250 people. So, but the general support also was requested, and the unanimity, and if anyone was against, should come and say, and not be shy, and say what are the reasons. If he wanted to go and talk with someone to give secretly that no, I don't agree because of this and that, then we would find corrections. But the Central Committee meeting went very well, and there was a lot of enthusiasm. That's how I accepted finally to take over. And so the People's Assembly, which was our parliament then, elected me as the President of the Republic, because the Constitution up to then was saying that the President of Frelimo will be the President of the Republic. Sure. Although we had already introduced the process of elections to confirm that the President of Frelimo, the Parliament had the power to elect the President of the Republic, but later I sought for the ratification of the Congress. So this is how we solved it. There was not a crisis among ourselves.
One final question, just in terms of another major transition that you were involved in the leadership of. Within Mozambique, you waged a civil war of sorts within Frelimo and Renamo, and this ended. And of course, there was a process then of a kind of reconciliation, of bringing Renamo into the fold. Yeah. And I mean, this must have been a major challenge as well. And how did you navigate that? What were the challenges you faced, and what did you do about them?
Well, when President Machel died, we were at the peak of this conflict, which I'll correct you. I don't call it civil war. I call it the war of destabilization. Because the war was imposed by the Apartheid regime, And the aim was to destabilize Mozambique so that the government of Frelimo falls and that the forces who dominated Mozambique before could reorganize themselves and be in power. And so that we should not be a danger, a big danger to apartheid. As they knew that we supported the liberation movements of South Africa, the liberation movements of Rhodesia. So they decided to destabilize Mozambique. President Machel was a big strategist, very intelligent. He had seen and well-defined who was our main enemy. And our main enemy was the apartheid, was Ian Smith. Therefore, he concentrated in the support first of the Zimbabwe national liberation movements. And we together, or they together with us, won over Ian Smith, and independence was proclaimed in Zimbabwe in 1980. After that, President Machel thought it was now necessary to turn the attention to the apartheid regime. Of course, President Machel did not do this in isolation, because the very frontline states had started the contacts with Ian Smith, and through President Kaunda, even with Foster. They had started these contacts to see if they could find a solution of the problems in a negotiated manner. But both Ian Smith and the apartheid, they did not accept this. So there was an effort to find a way out to the conflict. But President Machel continued. He tried to contact some leaders who could have influence on the Renamo, and this comprised the government of Kenya, because as I told you, at the very beginning of conflict, even in Frelimo, those elements ran and they found refuge in Kenya. So Renamo also had its presence in Kenya. They would use travel documents from Kenya. So President Machel thought that it was a good opportunity to contact the authorities, the Kenyan authorities. President Arap Moi himself was contacted by President Machel then. And so the lobbying to try and find out who are these elements of Renamo, because we even did not know exactly who they were. On the other end, he decided contacts should be made with apartheid, because the balance of forces was very much, there was a big gap. The apparatus of South Africa was too big, but we had to find a way to survive. And as he put it, we had to live or survive in order to be able to continue to support the liberation struggle in Southern Africa. We should not go to the adventure to let ourselves to be crushed. So we had to gain time for the very liberation movements to reorganize themselves, to let the situation consolidate in Zimbabwe, for them to reorganize themselves so that we have the joint support. Actually, we had the other front, which was Namibia. So President Machel started contacts. Americans were contacted also. And this culminated in the signing of a good neighborliness agreement with the apartheid regime. So we had to find other ways of supporting the liberation struggle, which would not be a very open and direct confrontation. Of course, we knew that the apartheid also was going to try and find other ways of supporting, continuing to support Renamo, because they had created that movement together with Rhodesia, and they created that movement. They armed and together with Portuguese renegades, those who didn't want to support the independence of Mozambique. These are the three elements who created what today is called Renamo, and at the time was called the MNR, which is the English version of Renamo. The translation came much later. So we, when Machel died, left all this background to me. As things were not easy, I had to think thoroughly. Well, I took advantage of 1 month that I had to be in bed in the hospital. I had nothing to do except to wait for my healing. So one of the things which I put in my head to think of was that, how to find a way out. So I decided that the main thing to do is to change the constitution, to create an environment which would give more confidence to our fellow countrymen who were in Renamo, that we can live all together. And so we could stop the war and live together. But I thought that, well, we cannot just tell them to stop the war. Yeah. The same way as we have negotiated with the Portuguese and negotiated with the apartheid, we should negotiate with them. And this time I said, negotiating through third parties was being done. It doesn't work because the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Kenya would come to Mozambique to meet me and then go to the bush and meet Renamo. So he knew where they were. And so actually President Machel had also established a link with Tiny Roland. Tiny Roland of the Lonro. Lonro, it was a company in Britain with interests in Mozambique and in Rhodesia. And so Lonro wanted peace to safeguard their businesses. And Lonro, or Tiny Roland also, was connected with the authorities in Kenya. So it was very, very adequate to work with them. So I followed this, which President Machel had left, but with the difference that I said, first let us create the environment. And what that meant that from 1988 to 1980, we were busy discussing the revision of the Constitution. We had a Constitution which we knew that had to evolve over time, that we had to consolidate our independence before trying to copy what the others were doing in the world. But I understood that also there were forces supporting Renamo because they thought that it was necessary to change the nature of our republic as we proclaimed it at independence. So the change of the Constitution was very much important also to gain more support internationally and to have all the forces to work towards a ceasefire, considering that they had interests in Mozambique. Some of the interests would be strategic, some would be economic. So I called for the revision of the Constitution. The revision of the Constitution should touch the biggest part of our population, up to the person who was in the village in the remote areas. That's why we had to have a consultation and an explanation of all what we were changing. So in 1990, we had a new constitution, which established a multi-party system, which streamlined the freedoms and rights of the citizens, which opened up or clearly turned it explicit the opening to the market economy. I'm saying it made it explicit because actually we didn't have a closed doors to the market economy, but it was not the policy. We had to establish the policy. I'm saying we didn't close up because we had big companies operating in Mozambique, private companies, which were foreign companies. And so they were free to do what is done in the market economy. We had capitalism in Mozambique even in those days when we had a centralized type of economy. But although it was a capitalism with the foreign capitalists, not Mozambican. But then we had to open this. So that constitution was proclaimed in 1990. So from there, we could tell Renamo and any other people who did not support our government or our party that if they so wish, they could form their own parties. and therefore Renamo could stop being an armed movement to become a political party and to challenge the government and to fight for power through democratic means. It was not easy because Renamo had committed such a big atrocities that it was unbelievable that we could accept to sit down around the same table and discuss. So I had to prepare the people to accept this. In the party, we had no problems. No leaders had the problems with the principle of negotiations and with Renamo. But the people did not understand. We are speaking about a dialogue with assassins, those who have their hands dirty of blood, those who did not hesitate to maim people, cutting noses, lips, ears, hands, legs, opening the wombs of pregnant women and so on. So they were said, why? Dumping the bodies in wells and rivers. I said, no, it's not possible. So I had to go district by district to announce that we had the intention of entering into direct dialogue with Renamo, that I myself was ready to talk with the leaders of Renamo. The people said, no, you should never contact those criminals. Send someone to tell them to stop. Said, okay, then we will start a dialogue with them. We'll create a delegation to go and talk to them. Said, no, not delegation, one man to go and tell them to stop. So no, we have to convince them to stop. But if they stop, they have to come back home. And they said, no, we don't want them here. They should stay where they are. I said, but they're in the bush. They're in Mozambique, but in the bush. It said, let them stay in the bush. So it was very hard to convince the people that if we want peace, we have to discuss with them. And after discussing with them, if they cease, they promise to cease them killing people, they will come, and that you will forgive them, will receive them, because afterward, they are some of your children. Some are your husbands who left you behind and they went to join there. So you have to receive them. And it took me a lot of time for the people to say yes. So I had to prepare the people for this dialogue, the direct dialogue. Because about the indirect dialogue, they were not much aware. So I asked for their support. And actually, when I was doing this, I took along with me a number of foreign diplomats for them to witness the hunger of the people against Renamo and their opposition to a direct dialogue with Renamo. So I was working on this. of course, there were some people who were thinking that the dialogue is something you think and you go to it. Some thought that, well, I was reluctant to go into dialogue. But finally, I had the support of religious people. And I started sending these religious people to different places, including the United States of America, to find who would be the interlocutor, because we knew that we are fighting with these people in the bush, but who would be the interlocutor? And so they went to United States, and there they found someone whom I had indicated that they could find there, and from this one they could find another one in Nairobi probably, and we contacted the people in Nairobi, and little by little we constituted the ways of reaching out to the interlocutors. So that's how we started preparing for the dialogue which took place in Rome. In Rome, it lasted 2 years. We had a delegation there, and we had a backing group in Maputo, working with the delegation so that we strategize to see where we could give concessions, where we should stay firm and whatnot. So during 2 years, we were working by telephone with the delegation, except for one occasion when we gave them a break to come and consult and refresh themselves at home. And President Gebuza was the leader of the delegation in Rome. And there was the leader of the commission, which was backing them up from Maputo. Yeah, but the constitution has changed a lot of things by clarifying all these liberties and where this adherence of the religious people and others. So we're on one side of unanimous and demanding peace, and this continues up to date.
And just in closing the interview, I just want to ask just one very quick question. Based on your life in leadership, what is the key insight that you think is the most valuable to pass on to other leaders in Africa, but the next generations?
This is contained in what I said different occasions when I had to lead something when I had to lead the nucleus of the students and so on. What I say to anyone, not only for the political leadership, but for any leadership, is that a leader emerges as someone who is seen by his peers as one who is dedicated to the cause in a particular manner that he distinguished himself. And he may distinguish himself because he is not ambitious for power. He is not working to be in power, but he is working for the success of the the cause which he is defending. In the case of liberation, is working towards a liberation, towards independence. But it could be a business leader who is in a business and who becomes distinct by his way of dedication, including help others to fulfill in a correct manner and a successful manner the assignments which they have for the success of the common objective. So this is how I see the leadership emerging, and of course the political leaders should have one thing in their heart is the people, and to do things which will be beneficial to the well-being of the people. So this is very important. So his own life becomes a secondary thing. And so all what comes after that derives from this principle. Today, I must say, because of what you are asking me, I'm telling you, giving you an answer. This answer will be seen by the viewers, and you will write it somewhere, and obviously you have read what others said about leadership. So there is a discipline now which is being created, which one can study leadership, not just to emerge, but to study. And his own attitudes may tend to tell him that he is preparing himself to be a leader, because he's studying what a leader should look like, what a leader should do. But of course, I have to say, you may study very much about these issues, but if you are driven only by your ambition, you may lose, because then you will tend not to do one of the elements which I said, which is solidarity with your peers, because you want to push them out. And instead of saying you come, you help them to succeed, and then you have an election, and the election will look, and so it will be the majority will going to say, this is the one. So I think that the leaders, we're speaking about succession, should be ready to acclaim the one who is elected and work with him. And work with him, and not to wait for him to commit mistakes before they can contribute for him to work correctly. So these are the few things which I don't have words. I'm not very good in English, but I think that the message will go. Of course, open to discussion. So what I wanted to say is that the leader nowadays is not just one who emerges, but also someone who can learn, can be prepared to be a leader. Today we have lots of problems of economic problems, of strategy and whatnot, and now one has to. Not all can come like I came, like Samora Machel came.
Thank you very much for your time and for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you.
It's been very enriching, and welcome back to Tanzania. It's nice to have you at our event.
Thank you.